A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was looking at a picture of a giant fuzzy orange puppet this morning, and for a second I felt this strange cold wave of existential dread. It is funny how childhood artifacts can do that to you. They are designed to be comforting. But when you look at them through the lens of 30 years of history, they start to look like ancient weathered totems of a lost civilization. Today is March 14th, 2026, and we are diving into a prompt from Daniel about the Irish children's show, The Morbegs. Honestly, it is the perfect vehicle for a deep dive into how we construct meaning, how we handle cultural trauma, and why every one of us might be carrying around a dying tree in our subconscious.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I have to say, Daniel really tapped into something profound with this one. On the surface, you have a show that premiered on RTE Network 2 back on September 30th, 1996. It was for kids aged 3 to 6. But when you look at the production notes, the sheer scale of the ambition is staggering. This was not just a puppet show. It was a highly engineered psychological environment designed to shape the emotional and social intelligence of an entire generation of Irish children. They spent 2 years in research and development before a single frame was shot. They had a budget of 1 million Irish pounds, which was a massive investment for the mid-90s. To put that in perspective, that is roughly 2 million euro in today's money spent on a show for toddlers.
1 million pounds for 2 puppets and a castle in the woods. That is a lot of pressure to put on Rossa and Molly. And I love the name, by the way. Morbeg. It is such a clever bit of linguistic play. You have more for big and big for small. It is almost a philosophical statement right out of the gate, isn't it? The idea that scale is relative.
It is directly inspired by the Turlough O'Carolan tune, See Big, See More, which translates to Big Fairy Hill, Small Fairy Hill. Carolan was a blind harper in the 17th century, a legendary figure in Irish music. The naming logic the creators used, specifically the script editor Francis Kay, was that what seems small to an adult is massive to a child. Perception is relative to the observer. In physics, we talk about frame of reference, but in the Morbegs, they were applying that to the emotional landscape of a 4-year-old. The world is a Morbeg place because it is simultaneously overwhelming and intimate. It is a sophisticated epistemic stance to take for a show that also features a character who is basically a giant orange sock.
A giant orange sock with a lot of baggage, as it turns out. But before we get to Ross's alleged midlife crisis and the burning of the tree, we should talk about the architecture of the show itself. It feels like it was caught between 2 different Irelands. You have the ancient mythological consciousness, the castles, the wizards, the Irish language woven into the scripts, and then you have the looming shadow of the Celtic Tiger. This was 1996. Ireland was about to undergo one of the fastest economic and cultural shifts in modern history. The show ran for 120 episodes, ending its original run in May of 1998, though it lived on in reruns until 2008. That decade was the pivot point for the entire nation.
That transition is baked into the show's DNA. You had human actors like Carrie Crowley playing these wizard-like figures who acted as mediators. They were bridging the gap between the magical, puppet-filled Morbeg land and the real world of the child viewer. It was a pedagogical bridge. They were teaching pre-literacy, verbal skills, and emotional regulation. But they were doing it within a framework of stewardship. The real heart of the show, the thing everyone remembers with this weird mix of reverence and anxiety, was the growing tree.
The growing tree. It was not just a prop, it was the central quest. Every episode felt like it was building toward this idea of maintenance. You had to save the tree. You had to care for the tree. If you didn't, the world itself felt like it was at risk. It is a very heavy concept to drop on a preschooler. Why do you think they chose a tree that was specifically growing rather than just a static symbol of nature?
That is the most fascinating part of the show's design. Most children's media uses symbols that are complete. A crown represents a king. A sword represents a hero. But a growing tree is a symbol of process. It is never finished. It is always in a state of becoming. If you look at the history of the axis mundi, the world axis that connects the heavens, the earth, and the underworld, it is almost always represented as a tree. But the Morbegs version emphasized the vulnerability of that axis. It required constant, collective effort to maintain. It was an animatronic prop, but in the minds of the children, it was the literal heartbeat of Morbeg land.
It sounds like they were accidentally teaching kids the basics of Kabbalah. If you look at the Etz Chaim, the Tree of Life in Jewish mysticism, it is not just a diagram. It is a map of divine emanations, the Sephirot. There are 10 nodes, and they are all interconnected by these paths of consciousness. The energy flows down from the infinite into the physical world, and our job as humans is to help that energy flow back up. It is a dynamic, growing system. The Morbegs were essentially asking 3-year-olds to engage in Tikkun Olam, the repair of the world, by tending to this digital analog hybrid tree.
The parallels with the Sephirot are actually quite striking when you look at the show's curriculum. They had specific days of the week dedicated to different things. Tuesdays were for social and environmental issues. That maps quite well onto the attributes of the Tree of Life. You have things like Chesed, which is loving kindness, and Gevura, which is strength or discipline. The show was trying to balance these emotional states in the viewer. They were building a moral infrastructure. But unlike the Kabbalistic tree, which is eternal, the Morbegs tree could die. That is where the cultural trauma comes in. The show instilled a sense of environmental and spiritual responsibility that was almost overwhelming.
I remember people talking about this for years after the show ended. There was this genuine, lingering question in the Irish psyche. Did they save it? Did the growing tree survive? It is like a collective, unfinished memory. And then you get these satirical reports, like the one from the College Times, that take that anxiety and turn it into a dark comedy. The idea that Rossa, this symbol of childhood wonder, eventually snapped and burned the tree down. It is a brutal image, but it speaks to a very specific kind of disillusionment.
That article is a masterpiece of Irish dark humor, but it also functions as a cultural Rorschach test. For those who don't know, the piece claims that after the show folded in 1998, Rossa fell off the wagon. He was seen acting out in Dublin, pulling the sock things on Molly's head, and finally, after a night out at Flannery's, he allegedly set the growing tree on fire. The report says it was the point of no return and that he eventually fled to Colombia. It even jokes that Molly became the actress Amy Huberman. It is absurd, but it touches on the archetypal fall of the hero.
It is hilarious because it is so jarring, but there is a reason it resonates. We see this in every major mythology. You have the figure who is the guardian of the sacred, and then they become the one who destroys it. Think about the Norse myths and Yggdrasil. The world ash is constantly under threat. You have the dragon Nihurg gnawing at the roots from below. You have stags eating the branches from above. It is a tree held together by constant, violent maintenance. But the Norse knew that eventually Ragnarök would come. The tree would tremble and the world would end. Rossa burning the tree is essentially a suburban Irish version of Ragnarök.
It is the moment where the burden of being a symbol becomes too much. In the Norse tradition, Odin hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 nights to gain the wisdom of the runes. He sacrificed himself to the tree to gain knowledge. The satirical narrative of Rossa is the exact inverse. Instead of self-sacrifice to gain wisdom, he engages in self-destruction to escape the responsibility of being a guardian. He destroys the tree because he can no longer live up to what it represents. He is the wounded healer who has given up on the healing part.
It reflects how Ireland felt in the late 90s and early 2000s. We were moving away from the old myths, away from the institutional influence of the church, and diving headfirst into this hyper-materialistic era. Burning the growing tree is a perfect metaphor for a society that is tired of the burden of innocence. We wanted to grow up, so we burned the thing that represented our childhood growth. We wanted to be sophisticated, so we turned our back on the castle in the woods and went to Flannery's instead. We traded the Axis Mundi for a pint of plain and a property bubble.
The timing of the show's run is so crucial here. It ended right as the Celtic Tiger was really starting to roar. The Ireland that watched the Morbegs was a very different place from the Ireland that would eventually look back on it with irony. There is a sense of loss there that people use humor to cover up. If you can make a joke about Rossa being a mess in Colombia, you don't have to deal with the fact that the earnest, research-backed idealism of the show's creators feels completely alien to us now. We have become cynical about the very idea of a growing tree.
You mentioned the research earlier. 2 years of prep for a show for 3-year-olds. That is an insane level of dedication. They were looking at pre-literacy skills, emotional regulation, and social dynamics. They were trying to build a better human being from the ground up. It makes the fall from grace narrative even more pointed. It is like saying, look at all this effort we put into being good, and we still ended up setting the tree on fire. It is a commentary on the fragility of civilization itself.
It reminds me of the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden. In the Christian tradition, that tree represents the ambivalence of growth. Gaining consciousness, gaining the ability to distinguish between good and evil, is also the moment of exile. You can't stay in the garden forever. The Morbegs were trying to keep the kids in the garden, but the culture was already halfway out the door. The growing tree was a symbol of that transition. It was a tree of life that we treated like a tree of knowledge. We wanted to know what happened when it stopped growing, and the answer was fire.
And the answer, at least in the satirical version, is that it burns. But let's look at the other side of this. The Bodhi tree in Buddhism. Siddhartha Gautama sat under a ficus religiosa and attained enlightenment. That tree represents the exact opposite of the quest in the Morbegs. In the show, the tree is something you have to actively save. It is a project. In Buddhism, the tree is a site of absolute stillness. You don't grow the tree, you grow under the tree. The tree is the precondition for your own internal awakening. It is the silent witness.
That is a vital distinction. The Morbegs tree was a Western activist tree. It was about stewardship and doing. The Bodhi tree is about being. There is a cutting from the original Bodhi tree in Sri Lanka that is considered the oldest documented tree in the world with a continuous history. It is still alive today. It didn't need to be saved in the way the Morbegs tree did, it just needed to be allowed to exist. Maybe that is the lesson we missed. We were so worried about the mechanics of growth that we forgot how to just sit still. We turned growth into a chore rather than a state of grace.
I think about that in the context of what we talked about in episode 1156, about the modern impulse to disappear. Rossa fleeing to Colombia is a weird, distorted version of that. It is the hermit's impulse, but born out of shame rather than a search for holiness. When the pressure of being a public symbol, the axis mundi of a nation's children becomes too much, you just want to vanish into the jungle. You want to go where no one knows your name is a pun on the Irish word for big. You want to be small again, but in a way that doesn't matter to anyone else.
There is a deep psychological weight to that. Carl Jung talked about individuation as an organic, non-linear process. He often used the metaphor of a tree. Your roots have to reach down into the dark, into the unconscious, so that your branches can reach up into the light. If you try to force the growth, or if you only focus on the branches, the tree becomes unstable. The growing tree in the Morbegs was always in danger because it was a public tree. It didn't have the privacy of the soul. It was a shared hallucination that we all had to agree to maintain.
That brings us to the big philosophical question Daniel posed. Do we all own a growing tree inside our souls? Is personal growth itself a sacred, universal archetype? It feels like we have moved away from that idea. In the age of the algorithm and constant self-optimization, we treat growth like a software update. It is something we download. It is linear. It is efficient. But a tree is messy. It has knots. It has seasons where it looks dead but is actually preparing for a burst of life. We have forgotten how to be dormant.
We have commodified the archetype. We have turned the growing tree into a productivity hack. But the real tree, the one the Norse and the Kabbalists and the Buddhists were talking about, is not efficient. It is costly. It requires the sacrifice of the ego. It requires you to be okay with being big before you can be more. The genius of the show's name is that it acknowledges that you are always both. You are small in the face of the universe, but your growth is a big, significant event. You are a microcosmos.
I wonder if the reason people still ask, did the tree survive, is because they are really asking if their own potential for growth survived the transition into adulthood. We look at Rossa and Molly, and we see our own innocence. If they failed, if the tree perished, then maybe we did too. Maybe we are all just acting the bollocks in our own version of Flannery's, trying to forget that we once had a castle and a quest. We are haunted by the ghost of a puppet show, because it represents a version of ourselves that still believe the world could be saved by a group of 4-year-olds.
But the thing about trees is that they are incredibly resilient. Even if you burn a tree, the roots often survive. There is a concept in ecology called the seed bank. The seeds stay in the soil for years, waiting for the right conditions. Some seeds even require fire to germinate. Maybe the growing tree isn't a physical prop in a studio in Dublin. Maybe it is a dormant archetype in the collective Irish subconscious, just waiting for a moment where we decide that being earnest is more important than being ironic. Maybe the fire was necessary to clear the old growth.
It is a beautiful thought, but it requires a lot of intentionality. You can't just wait for the tree to grow. You have to tend the soil. You have to be willing to do the 2 years of research on your own soul. I think about the people who made the show, the writers like Francis Kay who were weaving these deep emotional themes into scripts for toddlers. They were planting seeds that they knew they would never see reach full maturity. That is the ultimate act of faith. It is the definition of a civilization.
A society grows great when old men plant trees whose shade they know they shall never sit in. RTE in the 90s was, for a brief moment, acting like a civilization. They were planting a 1,000,000-pound tree in the minds of 4-year-olds. Even if the satirical Rossa burned it down, the fact that we are still talking about it in 2026 proves that the fire didn't finish the job. The symbol is still standing. It has moved from the screen to the psyche.
It makes me think about the wounded healer archetype again. Rossa, in his fallen state, is more relatable to us now than the perfect, fuzzy version from 1996. We are all wounded. We have all made mistakes that felt like we were setting our own internal forest on fire. But the archetypal path doesn't end at the fire. It ends with the rebirth. In Norse mythology, after Ragnarok, a new world emerges from the sea, and 2 humans who hid in the branches of Yggdrasil come down to repopulate the earth. The tree survives the end of the world. It is the ultimate survivor.
That is the hope, isn't it? That the structure of meaning is stronger than our ability to sabotage it. Whether it is the 10 Sephirot of the Kabbalah or the 9 realms of the Norse, these maps of reality suggest that there is an order to our growth. It is not just random. It follows a pattern. The Morbegs were trying to give us that pattern before we were old enough to realize we needed it. They were giving us a map of the soul disguised as a puppet show.
So, how do we apply this? If we accept that we have this internal growing tree, what is the practical takeaway for someone listening to this in 2026? We are surrounded by digital noise, by political tension, by the constant pressure to be more without ever acknowledging that we are big. How do we find our way back to the castle in the woods?
The first step is to identify what your tree actually is. What is the thing in your life that requires nonlinear patient growth? It is probably not your career or your social media following. It is likely something much more quiet. Maybe it is a relationship, or a craft, or your own moral integrity. Once you identify it, you have to realize that it can't be forced. You can't pull on the branches to make a tree grow faster. You can only provide the conditions. You can give it water, you can give it light, and you can protect it from the dragons at the roots. You have to be a steward, not a manager.
And you have to be careful about the Flannery's moments. We all have that impulse to self-sabotage when the burden of growth becomes too heavy. We want to be free of the responsibility of being a good person or a successful person. But burning the tree doesn't make you free. It just makes you cold. It leaves you in a world without an axis. It leaves you in a world where everything is big and nothing is more. True freedom comes from accepting the burden of the quest, not from fleeing to Columbia.
I think we should also look at the bilingual aspect of the show. They wove Irish into the English scripts. It was a linguistic stewardship. It was a way of saying that our heritage is part of the soil. If you want your tree to grow tall, you have to know what kind of earth it is planted in. You have to acknowledge the ancestors, the language, and the stories that came before you. You can't grow a tree in a vacuum. You need the nutrients of the past to fuel the growth of the future.
That is a great point. The axis mundi is always local. It is always planted in a specific place. For the Morbegs, it was a castle in Ireland. For us, it might be our community or our family history. We have to stop trying to grow universal, generic trees and start tending to the specific ones in our own backyard. We have to be present in our own geography, both physical and spiritual.
It is also worth noting that the quest in the show was often a collective one. The viewers were encouraged to participate. Did we save the tree? Not. Did Rossa save the tree? There is a profound lesson there about communal responsibility. We are all stewards of each other's growth. If your tree is struggling, I have a responsibility to help you tend it, because we are all living in the same forest. Our roots are interconnected. In a real forest, trees share nutrients through a fungal network. We need a spiritual version of that.
That is a very different vibe from the rugged individualism we see so much of today. The idea that my growth is dependent on yours. It is an ecological view of the soul. If the growing tree dies, Morbeg land becomes a wasteland for everyone, not just for the puppets. We are all in this together, whether we like it or not. The health of the collective tree determines the health of the individual branches.
And maybe that is why the show has such a lasting grip on the Irish imagination. It was one of the last great communal myths we had before the internet fractured our attention into a million different pieces. We all watched the same show, we all cared about the same tree, and we all felt the same weird, low-level anxiety when it went off the air. It was a shared emotional infrastructure. It was a moment of national unity centered around a fuzzy orange puppet and a piece of animatronic wood.
So, to answer Daniel's question, yes, we do all have a growing tree inside our souls. And yes, personal growth is a sacred, universal archetype. But it is a fragile one. It requires a £1,000,000 investment of time and attention. It requires us to be wizards and stewards and, occasionally, giant orange puppets. We have to be willing to look at the fire and decide to plant something new anyway. We have to believe in the growing part of the tree, even when it feels like everything is burning down.
I think we should end on that note of resilience. The Morbegs might be a memory, and the growing tree might be a mystery, but the impulse to grow is still there. It is the most more thing about us. It is the thing that connects us to the ancient harpers and the future children. It is the thread that runs through the entire tapestry of human experience.
I'm going to go home and check on my plants. And maybe stay away from Flannery's for a while, just in case. I don't want to take any chances with my internal forest.
Probably a wise move. The trees will thank you. And remember, even the smallest sprout has the potential to become a giant fairy hill.
This has been a fascinating journey into the fuzzy heart of Irish mythology. I think it is safe to say we have successfully saved the growing tree for at least one more day. We have kept the axis spinning.
Or at least we have identified where the watering can is. That is half the battle. Knowing that the tree exists is the first step toward saving it.
It really is. Before we wrap up, I want to thank our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the castle running and making sure the puppets don't start any fires in the studio. He is the unsung wizard of this operation.
And a huge thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. They are the digital soil our weird little tree grows in. Without that processing power, we would just be two guys talking to a dead stump.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you have been enjoying our deep dives into the puppets and philosophies of the past, please consider leaving us a review on your podcast app. It really does help other people find the show and join the quest. We are trying to grow this community, one listener at a time.
You can also find us at myweirdprompts.com for the full archive and all the links to subscribe. We have a lot of other episodes exploring the intersection of pop culture and deep philosophy.
We will be back next time with another prompt from Daniel. Until then, keep an eye on your internal forest and make sure you are giving it enough light.
And remember, scale is relative. What seems small today might be the biggest thing in your world tomorrow. See you next time.
Bye for now. Stay more, everyone.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts.